Hi, welcome to Productive C Sharp. In this video, I want to share how you can query an Azure Cosmos DB using the SQL API in C Sharp. So let's assume we have a document store that contains a set of libraries, and each library, as you can see in Data Explorer, contains a name and a list of books. Each book has a title, the number of pages, and a list of authors. Okay, so I've already created an Azure Cosmos DB account with this data. I'm going to show you now how I created this data, and then we can actually see three different ways to query a document store. So let's switch to Visual Studio, and let me show you very quickly the object model that we are going to use. So there's a library class with a name and a books, list of books, and then the book class with title, pages, and authors. That basically match the JSON document that I've shown you before. If I go to the program, so what I have is an account URL and the primary key of the Azure Cosmos DB account, the database ID, and in the static constructor, I create a document client and I create a document collection URI. In the main, then I create and populate the database. So I'm going to show you very quickly how I did this, how I actually created the database, and then we can look at the queries. So what I did is I created a database if it doesn't exist. I created a document collection called libraries with a name as a primary partition key. Then I delete the document collection, I think just as a way to be able to run this program multiple times and not duplicate the data. And as you can see here, I basically create a list of books and two libraries, and then I actually create two documents asynchronously, library 1 and library 2. So basically, running this code, create and populate the database. Okay, now, when I run this code, it's basically creating the database. Then the first way to actually query the database is using a SQL statement. So Microsoft implemented a SQL, basically a SQL-like query language that is actually querying on top of JSON. And if you already know SQL, it should be relatively easy to write these queries. And there is an extensive documentation available online. Let's have a look. For example, let's see if I want to get all the books from library 1, and the books written by Peter. And I want to know the title and the pages for each book. So a query would look like that. So I'm basically doing select the title and the pages from library. Then I do a self-join to library books, and then I do the query, like checking that the library name is library 1, and using array contains, that's a built-in function available in Azure Cosmos DB that allows me to check that the authors array contains Peter. So that's fairly straightforward. And the main API to use is the create document query method. You provide the collection URI and the query, and then you can actually do a for each or just basically iterate through the document to the collection. You can print the result. So this is actually how you can run a SQL query basically in Azure Cosmos DB. However, it's usually a best practice to use parameterized SQL queries so that you can actually provide a parameter so you can run this query, not just for checking all the books written by a particular author, but any author you want to provide. So this is extremely similar to writing parameterized query using ADO.NET. So if you're already familiar with ADO.NET, you should really feel at home here. So this is the same query I actually created before, but instead of actually providing the name directly in the SQL, I use basically a parameter, SQL parameter, using the symbol. And then I create a SQL query from this string, and I add a new parameter mapping the name of the parameter with the actual value that is provided inside the method. And then I can run the query in the similar way. So this is how you can actually run parameterized queries. And finally, you can use LINQ. So Microsoft implemented a LINQ provider on top of the SQL API, so that basically you can use your LINQ to SQL API to query Azure Cosmos DB. So the way you do it, you create a document query, passing only the collection URI, And then you can use the classic link operators like where, like many, and so on to the query. And this is basically how you could do it. All right, you do a where, select many, and so on. So now let's try to run this code and see if the result is what we expect. So the first query basically return JSON. Each element is actually JSON that contains title and pages. And the second one is the same, and the last one also will return anonymous types, title and pages, because we are using the link provider. I want to show you very quickly what actually happened under the covers in the last one. So what's actually the query that is actually executed. I have Fiddler open here, and you can see on this call that the actual query used by Microsoft is, if you look closely, is exactly the same as the query we actually wrote manually. Slightly different names, of course, of the variables, but at the end is exactly the same query. So it's up to you to decide which is the right way, your preferred approach to query Azure Cosmos DB. But as you can see, if you already know SQL, and if you are already familiar with Link, you can fairly quickly get up to speed in using Azure Cosmos DB and querying the database effectively. So I have a look at the resource section. I provided some links with the documentation, and you can basically have a list of all the supported SQL syntax from Microsoft, and included all the built-in functions available. You can extend the functions available using JavaScript. You can write store procedures and user-defined types using JavaScript, but we are not going to touch those in this video. And I think this is everything. Thank you very much for watching.